is Monday, November 27th, Medical College of Wisconsin. This is Tavio Akimascu here. Welcome to our latest and newest Implementation Science for Innovation and Discovery Series conference. Today, we have a special guest speaker from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Andrew Quanbeck. Unfortunately, he could not be here in person as we were chatting earlier, but we will accept for now a virtual presentation and hopefully will compensate for a future in-person visit. I will tell you a little bit about Dr. Quanbeck. He's pretty well known in the field of implementation science, so we thought we would benefit a lot from his contribution in a presentation like this, telling us a little bit about his experience, the experience at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Quanbeck is an associate professor in the University of Wisconsin Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. His research draws upon concepts from systems engineering to develop innovative approaches to implement evidence-based practices with a specific focus on implementation of EBPs and technologies for the prevention and treatment of substance use disorders in medical care settings. The innovative approaches to implementation he has developed have been evaluated in multiple NIH-funded trials and have led to health improvements for patients suffering from addiction. Dr. Quanbeck is currently principal investigator on not less than 4 NIH-funded R01s that use innovative systems engineering approaches to promote the implementation of evidence-based interventions for the prevention and treatment of substance use disorders. He has authored 40 peer-reviewed publications, 16 as lead author. He's a standing member of the NIH's Science of Implementation in Health and Healthcare Studies section, and a member of the editorial board of the journal Implementation Research and Practice. He will talk to us about building dissemination and implementation research capacity at a clinical and translational research award hub in Madison. Dr. Quanbeck, welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll dive right in, and feel free at any point to jump in with questions, either in person or via the chat. But today I thought I could, spend some time talking about our dissemination and implementation infrastructure. We call it the launch pad, kind of how it came about and what we're currently offering. I was also going to talk about a paper that I've been working on with a colleague on sort of the overlap in the literature between implementation research and translational research, or maybe more aptly stated, the lack of overlap between those two fields. I'll talk a little bit about some things that are going on nationally at other hubs related to D&I research. Talk about the content of a special issue in JCTS on this topic. Talk about the MCATS funded work group for advancing D&I research in CTSA hubs and details on how to get involved with it, something that I've been involved with for several years, and then close with hopefully some discussion around potentials for collaboration between MCW and UW-Madison. So just wanted to put funding. I have obviously the MCATS CTSA award, been supported by grants from NIDA and NIAAA, and then I have disclosures related to a shareholder interest in a technology company, and I also provide consulting on implementation research through a nonprofit called the NIATEX Foundation. I wanted to call out a few people for thanks. Really the work I'm going to discuss is I've been involved in some of it, but it's been a huge effort at the institutional level. Some of the big players, I think, are Maureen Smith, who's the director of the Community Engagement Corps for our CTSA, Jane Mahoney, the director of the D&I Launchpad, and Felice Resnick, who's the lead scientist and really runs a lot of the day-to-day operations there. Alan Brazier and Beth Burnside are the current PIs of ICTR. Rose Garza Hennessy, who was a postdoc working in my lab, is now at UW-Milwaukee, and we're still working together on publications. And then I won't list all the names, but the past and current leaders of the CTSA funded national work group on advancing D&I research in CTSA hubs. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in Watertown, and as I understand, you're at the a location on Watertown Plank Road. So that's where I grew up. I've been coming to Milwaukee for most of my life, and have a lot of friends and connections there. I from Watertown went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Majored in industrial and systems engineering. Actually had my first professional engineering job as a co-op student in Milwaukee, working for Harley-Davidson, which was a great experience. After I finished my undergraduate degree, I moved to Denver and worked in industry there. Actually doing a lot of hospital construction, designing and implementing the heating and air conditioning systems for medical facilities. So I came back to do a PhD in systems engineering back in 2005 after working in industry for 4 years. And a lot of people have kind of asked me, what's the connection between engineering and medicine? I think this is a great definition of what engineering is really about. This comes from the president of the National Academy of Engineering, that really at its core, engineering is about making science useful to people. And in that sense, I think it's really well tuned to implementation, research, and translational science. So that's kind of my background. And to get into how our D&I infrastructure came about, it's really been guided by the Wisconsin idea, which I think is probably familiar to all of us. The idea that's, goes back to 1904, that really, we're not just about educating in the classroom, but that the research that's done at the university should be applied to improve the health and quality of life for citizens of the state and across the nation. So we've, I'm sure if as a CTSA hub, you're familiar with some of these terms. We have the Community and Academic Partnership Core at the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research. So we call it ICTR-CAP. It's a federation of 38 community and practice-based research networks and programs that really spans, the Madison area, but across the state, including a pretty large influence in the Marshfield area. We engage in annual strategic planning with the ICTR-CAP programs 4 to 6 times per year. So this is really Maureen Smith, who's leading strategic planning for ICTR-CAP. And that's done on a semi-annual basis, and performance metrics are submitted twice a year just to kind of, work together towards common goals. So this, it's kind of, I'm going to give you a history. I wasn't even really involved with ICTR back in 2011. I came back to UW-Madison in 2005. But the CTSA program, I think, started in 2007, and UW-Madison was among the first cohort that was funded. And as part of that first award, there was a strategic planning process in 2011 to explore gaps in the translational research spectrum. For the second round of renewal, that was 2012. And so Maureen Smith met with the ICTR-CAP steering committee, and then met as a group, and then did individual interviews with each member. And it was, a pretty systematic process that employed facilitated group decision-making so that we could identify and prioritize gaps in the translational research spectrum. And so all the way back in 2011, this process identified a lack of resources for dissemination and implementation research as the primary gap that needed to be addressed to increase the impact of our CTSA. We, through that process, learned that there's a lot of pretty well-established systems in place to support dissemination of patentable technologies like drugs and devices, but really for non-patentable innovations and health interventions, there wasn't really a lot of support available. And back in those days, it was evident that very few investigators engaged in D&I research within the CTSA. So as a result of that process, we included a dedicated D&I aim in the 2012 NIH CTSA application. And the aims were to increase the use of research to improve practices, programs, and policies, disseminate research results and methods through our existing community practice and policy networks, and facilitate D&I of research results between investigators and their community partners. So all of that stakeholder engagement kind of led us to the creation of the D&I Launchpad. And, you know, we're now, I guess, about 11 years into the existence of the D&I Launchpad. It's constantly evolving. But some of the core features, I put a link to the website so you can explore. I'm just going to give you kind of some highlights of what we created to address some of the needs that we identified through this stakeholder engagement process. So the kind of our main categories of services around education and resources, research consultation, and implementation support. So the first gap is just basically that, you know, in the beginning, very few researchers on campus knew anything about D&I science. So one of the first things we did is create an annual short course that would allow us to feature national and local leaders in D&I science. And we just finished the latest round of our D&I short course in 2023. It was hosted on campus. We had really excellent guest faculty, Doctors Amy Kilborn and Danny Elmerell from the University of Michigan, and J.D. Smith from the University of Utah, all doing cutting edge implementation and translational research. And, you know, we had a turnout of about 120 people, mostly from Madison, but it is turned in kind of a regional and sometimes even national and international event. During COVID, we were forced to go virtual like everyone else, and it had sort of the unintended consequence that we actually got in 2020, we had representatives from 24 countries across the world who participated virtually in our D&I annual short course. And we've had really outstanding topics and guest faculty every year, going back to 2017, which I think was the first year that we did this. But this is something that, you know, really drives a lot of our activities. More recently, we've created a program called the Implementation Science and Community Health Outcomes Certificate. So this is, I teach a class on translational research with a focus on implementation in the population health department. This certificate is really open to PhD level and professional students who want to get, you know, some credentials in implementation science. It's a 2-year commitment, 15 graduate level credits. And that program has been growing. It was just instituted, I think, about 3 years ago, and some of the first graduates are coming through at this point. So it's exciting to see that happening. And that was partly in response to the fact that, you know, I review grants for NIH implementation research grants, and it's often difficult to sort of establish your bona fides as an implementation researcher. So through this program, investigators can get, you know, formal training and a certificate that they can use for their CVs and so forth to help kind of establish their credibility in implementation science. We also recently launched something called the Dissemination Research and Implementation Science Seminar, probably quite similar to this program that we're doing right now. It's offered monthly on Fridays over lunch. with virtual and in-person attendance options. This is really more of an opportunity for researchers on campus to showcase some of their current activities, get feedback, and kind of build a community and a network locally around the practice of implementation and dissemination research. Moving into another gap, we learned early on that UW researchers really didn't know much about D&I research and required D&I support to submit competitive research grants. So we created a consultation service available to all, any researcher across campus who wanted to write research grants, whether they're D&I or just have a D&I component. And so this is a service that basically on our public website, individuals can request a consult and meet with people like me. I've done hundreds of consults through the years. I'm kind of stepping away from that role recently, but it's managed by a group of experts. Our faculty director, Jane Mahoney, Andy Garbitz is a faculty member supporting the team, and then we have a staff of PhD level researchers and research scientists and administrative support. So currently, our D&I Launchpad team consists of 6 people, although it's kind of the composition kind of goes up and down through time. I didn't have a chance to update this slide, but I just wanted to show the last time I had presented on this topic from 2015 to 2019. We've had people from all over campus who I would say are now really themselves national experts. A lot of these individuals, Heidi Brown, Nancy Pondy, Lindsay Steege, Todd Molfenter, are have gotten at least one or multiple implementation research grants. So in over a 5-year period, we had about 500 requests and 212 unique consults, 500 researchers involved, and overall got almost half were able to achieve external funding through this support. So I think it's been a really valuable service. It's helped build our capacity internally so that individuals who didn't know much about D&I science are now off and doing D&I research on their own. We kind of built that up through our consult service. The next gap is the challenges faced in scaling up innovations to the point of commercialization. And this kind of really gets to that gap that we identified where individuals with non-patentable health interventions didn't have a lot of support. So we wanted to fill that gap by offering something that we called the Evidence Implementation Award that would provide full service go-to-market resources. So it's the Evidence Implementation Award. It's a competitive kind of grant program that we run. We provide we call it a Launchpad package that supports dissemination implementation. That includes a customized business plan, marketing, sales, financials, and intellectual property review. The award provides $75,000 in direct support, as well as, very importantly, in-kind support in these sort of business-oriented domains for 18 months. And we've been fortunate to be funded not only through the CTSA, but also with funding from the Wisconsin Partnership Program to support that, the Evidence Implementation Award. So I played a role in developing the the review criteria for the Evidence Implementation Award. It came from some of my own research, well, not my own research, my own reading of research in the kind of the world of decision analysis and behavioral economics. So this is research from an organization called the Canadian Inventors Assistance Program. They developed a multi-criteria kind of rating system to evaluate the commercial viability of new business ventures, and then gave a score from A to A, B, C, D, or E, and we're able to. I think what's not to go deep into the numbers here, but what is interesting about this rating system is that by applying it, it could quite accurately predict failure of. It's still hard to predict success because a lot of things can go wrong, but those that were recommended for development with an A rating, about 71% made it to commercial success with positive rates of return, and for those that were rated doubtful or to stop development, basically a very low percentage, probably on the order of 1% were successful. So this rating system can kind of help screen out ideas that are not likely to work. So we adapted that system. We have an expert. We take reviewers from the community, often with a business background or nonprofits, have them rate projects on features and benefits, demand from target customers, competition and barriers to entry, potential for impact. And then we look at sustainability issues around partners and purveyors, sustainability, the financial models that support the innovation. We look at readiness of the innovation to go to market, as well as readiness of the investigator and the team to do what is going to be required to take ventures through to commercialization. So just very quickly, I'll highlight some of our funded programs. The Tai Chi Prime for community-based falls prevention was one of our first, led by Betty Tuning, a professor in the School of Pharmacy. So this is really geared towards helping teach older adults Tai Chi based on good evidence and research done by Dr. Tuning. I often, on my way to my office, drive by the Tai Chi Center that came out of this off Midvale Boulevard in Madison. I know that this has now been scaled up to some community-based sites in Milwaukee as well. So it's that is a program, one of our first, that is still viable and sustained through the present day. One of the other early grantees was Dr. Caprice Greenberg, who formed the Academy for Surgical Coaching. And as far as I know, I haven't kept up as well on this program, but the idea here is to for surgeons to work with other surgeons to provide advice and support for new surgical technologies, and to get those out into the field more as quickly as possible through expert consultation. The next round of grantees, one focused on teleophthalmology for diabetic eye screening. Another looking at staying healthy after childbirth. We're looking at high blood pressure for moms, and then mobilizing older adults via system-based intervention. So that's a falls-based intervention within the hospital setting. So those have been the first 5. We've had 2 more funded since then. I didn't get a chance to add them, unfortunately. We've also kind of, as part of this endeavor, we did an environmental scan to look at similar programs at CTSA organizations across the country. And so we conducted an environmental scan. This was part of the national working group that I mentioned earlier. We talked to 16 different CTSA hubs, and as well as the associated technology transfer and commercialization offices at these hubs, representing 19 states and 24 institutions nationwide. And the focus was really on, what if you're a researcher who has developed an evidence-based health intervention, but it's not eligible for patent, basically if it's not a drug or a medical device, what kind of resources are available to help support commercialization. And we found, there's not a lot of this out there. Most places don't have funding for this type of support. Lack of support personnel, faculty doesn't know or care much about commercialization, difficulty identifying industry partnerships, and really the kind of mismatch between the tenure track and tenure process, and that commercialization efforts being kind of a distraction from gaining tenure. Some of the things that we did see some places that were doing things well, like University of Colorado, for instance, provides educational programs on intellectual property, D&I, and commercialization. There's a few places offering marketing support services and funding opportunities similar to the Evidence Implementation Award Program. And, we think it's important to increase support staff of non-patentable innovations in D&I and more support through tech transfer offices. So we, as when we were writing, we wrote a paper about kind of this whole process, and with the idea that, we were, I guess, University of Wisconsin, you might call, using the parlance of D&I research, sort of an early adopter in terms of, creating a D&I infrastructure in 2012. And, we want to be transparent and just kind of show what we've done, why we did it, successes, challenges, failures. And I included this picture in the paper that we wrote about the process, and just kind of, these different streams of activities all coming together to try to maximize the impact of the research that we're doing at CTSAs, and hopefully, spreading across the country. We're not confined just to UW-Madison or even the state of Wisconsin. We've been very, very broad in our networking and outreach to other CTSA hubs, and trying to build a supportive environment across the country so that the best ideas that are out there can maximize their impact. So some of the takeaways about the process, having specific aims helps clarify goals and what you're and get everyone on the same page. This has been a very, it wasn't like a one-time deal. We build programs kind of one at a time. It's been iterative and incremental. It continues to be that way. We ensure that we have these stakeholder engagement meetings on a regular basis so that we keep learning what's most important from our end users' perspective. We think we've been really fortunate that the leaders of our CTSA have really made D&I a priority and have provided, resources to help support that. And, we have metrics in place so that we continuously kind of monitor, if these programs are working well, do we need to change course? Do we need to start a new program? And so forth. And, that's kind of in line with my engineering background. So if you want to read more about these basically the process overall, as well as the development of the Evidence Implementation Award. I was lead author on papers that kind of describe in more detail what I just went over briefly there, so you can check those out. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit into another kind of area that really was a curiosity project for me and Rose Hennessy Garza, who I've been in touch with, and I'm the senior author on this paper. She's the lead author. She's at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And it was kind of driven by the idea that I've identified as an implementation scientist and started working with ICTR and just didn't see a ton of overlap between the worlds of implementation science and the world of translational science. And I didn't have any real way to quantify that, but I thought it'd be interesting to look to see if we could understand how integrated the fields are and potentially try to quantify it to some extent. So the way that we went about this is by doing a bibliographic analysis to look at the interconnections between literature and translational science and implementation science. And we wanted to identify publications that kind of bridge the two fields and quantify the overlap of scientific inquiry within translational science and implementation science. And then, see based on what we found, what kind of applications there might be for practice and research. So again, I just picture these Venn diagrams, which is sort of the theme, which we'll go through some of the illustrations. You'll see some of the or the directed citation networks. So we have, a corpus of literature related to translational research and another corpus of research related to implementation research. When I think of what implementation research is based on, I often tell the story that I read this book, Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers, when I was an engineering undergraduate student at UW-Madison back in the late 90s. And, we talk about implementation science being a new field, but this was something that I was learning in my health systems engineering undergraduate curriculum back in the 90s. And this text is really foundational to the field of implementation science. And so I think it's interesting that, really the first example of a technology transfer kind of system for diffusion of innovations is the Agricultural Extension Service. So this implementation science in some ways really started with farmers in Iowa, trying to maximize the output of their corn harvest by using the best seeds and the best techniques of farming, and that goes all the way back to the post-World War II era. So the diffusion, the tradition of public health and medical sociology came soon after that in the 1950s. So this book talks about innovation studies like new drugs or other medical ideas where the adopters are doctors or other health professionals, or family planning methods or health innovations where the adopters are clients or patients. So that's really, that's what I've been working on in my own research, and I think what a lot of us are working on. So Implementation Science, the journal, didn't come out until 2006, but I don't think it doesn't mean, from my perspective, that this topic hasn't been around. I guess the definition that we use for translational research comes from a paper called Translating Translation. Christopher Austin, at least at the time, was the director of NCATS. And so kind of defined the field of investigation, which seeks to understand the scientific and operational principles underlying each step of the translational process, and kind of draws a line between translational science and translational research, where translational research focuses on the specific case of a target or disease. Translational science is focused on a case that applies to any target or disease. And so I think the translation D&I science is kind of tends to be more geared towards the end user stage. So I've always envisioned D&I science as being kind of a subset of translational science, towards the traditional kind of tail end of the translational research spectrum. But basically, at core, both translational implementation sciences aim to bridge the gap between what works to address health and what is actually done to address health. So trying to, get the best medical advances into the hands of people as quickly as possible. And so I, in part, driven by this curiosity, is that our researchers and our leaders in these fields citing each other as one way to kind of quantify the degree of collaboration and what can the fields potentially learn from each other. So we did a systematic search of literature and implementation science and translational science. I won't go too deep in the details, but followed a lot of the best practices for systematic reviews, looked through Web of Science, as well as articles, review articles, books, and book chapters. We used search terms related to the two fields that came through some of the were used in other similar kinds of systematic reviews. So one is the Fort et al. Article from 2017, published in JCTS, and then Davis and DeLima 2020, which is from the implementation science literature. So just kind of looking through and searching, of articles that are kind of indexed under these headings, which are the most highly cited, and then as a second phase, which are the most intercited. So we, as a first step, looked at updating a literature review in part that was done by Fort et al. In 2017 to look at the most highly cited papers in literature. And what we found is that there were the top 50 had about 51,000 sightings. Their stats on the sort of the median, min, and max. The top cited publications, both by Harris, really describe the REDCap, Research Electronic Data Capture, and the REDCap Consortium. And then this next one is related to poor correlation genomic responses between mouse models and human inflammatory diseases. So really kind of a pretty topic and disease specific citation. Implementation science, when we looked at the top 50 there, a few, not quite as many citations, but you didn't have the one that really stood out like the REDCap citation. If you know implementation science, the most highly cited article is the Damschroeder et al. 2009 description of the development of the consolidated framework for implementation research, which is very highly based on Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory. It's sort of I think an extension of it to modern day application. And then a couple of other pretty well cited articles about purposeful sampling strategies and recommendations for mixed methods. And then Proctor et al. 2011 looks at sort of a taxonomy of implementation outcomes to help design evaluations for implementation studies. So then we did, we wanted to do sort of graphical and quantitative visualizations of the two different citation networks. And this is a little bit hard to see, but this will give you an idea of how clustered together the citations from the Translational Science Network are. 6,000 publications. There were almost 5,000 shared citations between the included publications. And I'm not going to go into the details here. I think the pictures are maybe the more interesting thing, but you know, there's not a ton of links, 118, 101, and 92. So the Harris article, even though it was the most cited, was not the most intercited article. That was this Corey et al. 2007 overview of a 4-phase framework for translational research in genomics, and then Rubio was second with the needs for a workforce in translational science or in translational research. This is a quick look at the implementation science directed citation network. 7,000 publications. There were 25,000 links between the included publications. So here, Dan Schroeder et al. was both the most highly cited and the most intercited publication, as well as the Proctor et al. 2011 was similarly highly cited and very intercited. And then this Graham et al. Gives definitions for terminology and conceptual framework to integrate knowledge creation with application. So we then looked at combining the networks to assess the degree of academic overlap between the two citation networks, and tried to in the discussion of the paper, and we're actually getting ready to do final revisions, and hopefully we'll have this approved soon and published in JCTS, and kind of interpreting the overlap between translational science, implementation science, and literature. So this is just kind of putting the two together. Again, it's just a lot to look at, but I think sometimes these visual representations can be useful, showing the kind of the mass of publications. On the left is implementation science, on the right is translational science, and you see that there's this overlapping area. So then we wanted to try to quantify the degree of overlap. We wanted to look at the change in citations between publications when they're looked at in their own network and by combining the networks. So this is the translational science world. 21 of the 50 publications didn't have any citation links in either network map. The top cited, or 42% of the top cited publications are getting cited in other disciplines. And there were only 7 publications that had over 100% increase in citation links. So of the other 22 of the top 50, very small kind of increase in citation links by combining the networks. For implementation science, again, not a lot of, there was only 1 publication that had over 100% increase in citation links. Similarly, 47 publications. So really, the vast majority had a very small increase in citation links when you put the two together. So we identified one article that was sort of the main bridge between the two fields. It's called The Answer 17 Years. What is the Question? Understanding Time Lags in Translational Research. And I didn't put, it's by Morris, 2011. So that came through as the most, sort of the link between these two fields. So our conclusions is that there's a very modest overlap between the literature being cited across the two fields. When you put the two networks together, the increase in citations goes up not greater than 4%. There's a couple of publications that can help model collaboration. The Harris Redcap article, and then this the answer is 17 years by Morris. And overall, of interest, implementation science publications are more interconnected than translational science. 5 times the number of citation links for implementation versus translational science. So limitations, we looked only at Web of Science, the usual kind of limitations of systematic search. There's no way of knowing if we miss things. This issue of the difference between implementation or translational science and translational research can get a little bit sticky, and semantics are always difficult to deal with. And then there's time lags and citation networks, and papers that have been around longer are more likely to be cited, just as sort of the accumulated nature of citations over time. So I think the implications are, as we're looking to kind of merge and integrate the fields of implementation science, D&I research, and translational science, we identified this article by Huang et al. To reinforce and expand upon 3 recommendations to integrate and share methods, frameworks, and study designs, stress interdisciplinary collaboration, and informed training programs. So look for that. That paper has not been published yet, so those results are preliminary, but we're have to do the final revisions and approval this month. So I hope to be able to share that article soon, but that's kind of a sneak peek at what we're finding with that. So I think at this point, you're probably all aware that in July of 2021, NCATS has a new requirement for inclusion of dissemination implementation activities. And I put a link to the funding announcement there. I wanted to, it's hard to say that there's a cause and effect relationship between things, but you will see by reading. So I think the best way to get ready, if you haven't tackled this at your hub, probably the best way to get ready is to take a look at a special issue on dissemination implementation science published in JCTS in 2020. I mentioned this working group, and this was a key activity of the working group. We had 34 of the 64 hubs represented as authors in this special issue. Again, it was co-edited by Dr. Kathleen Stevens and Dr. Jonathan Tobin, who are now 2 of the leaders of our collaborative working group. And so they really helped organize and made this special issue happen. So just wanted to point you to the introduction to the special issue. There were 19 articles published in the special issue, and the editors, did their best kind of to compartmentalize the set of papers on a number of different themes. And I'll just kind of show how they were sorted out here. So you'll see the first one is on stakeholder engagement and workforce development, and that's where the paper that I talked about was sorted on stakeholder engagement. But this looking at engagement science, and a couple of sort of specific examples of clinical guideline implementation and study on heart failure. So 4 articles there. Return of results, I think a really important topic and something that we don't always do very well in community engaged research. So a couple of articles looking at, what are best practices for communicating, disseminating research findings to participants, and what are participant preferences for receiving study results. Team science is certainly a big theme. I think it's something that we really embody at UW-Madison, very multidisciplinary. I'm as an engineer, I work with physicians across a lot of different parts of the university, and statisticians, and anthropologists, qualitative researchers. So the role of team science is really important. And then learning health systems is also a topic that has become really prominent. And so how we embed D&I research in learning health systems. There you see an article by Amy Kilborn, who I had mentioned before was our guest faculty. So looking at accelerating implementation of research in learning health systems in VA. And the CTSA hubs, looking at bridging the gap between research policy and practice, and another article on linking D&I science to learning health systems and opportunities for clinical and translational science board hubs. Monitoring and maintaining fidelity. So I think a lot of this kind of gets to the role of measurement, with some case examples, as well as, an article. I haven't read all of these, I have to be honest, but the role of data and safety monitoring boards and implementation trials, something I've wondered about. Obviously we often need to have those for patient level RCTs, but not always clear for implementation studies. So just, you've got a lot of individuals with a lot of experience just kind of writing about their experience as they're navigating sort of the landscape of D&I research in the CTSA environment. And then finally, looking at just how we can speed things up. It's always a priority, looking at global health, looking at health equity. We've had some papers on these topics. I think health equity is something I would definitely call out as being a theme that's moving forward and with greater speed. So Reza Yousefi Noure wrote an article on health equity through CTSA programs. That was part of the special issue. He's now one of the leaders of the new work group, and I know that advancing health equity through CTSA is going to be a major theme of the new work group. So the special issue, which I definitely recommend checking out, provided definitional and conceptual foundations for discussing D&I research and science. Really, I think an explicit goal was to kind of set the stage for describing the current state of D&I sciences through the collective perspectives of all the authors who are all engaged in CTSA work, and really serve to summarize some of the leading scientific work and key points to advance for developing scientific consensus in the field. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, I have mentioned kind of throughout, is what is the NIH NCATS D&I working group. It's now, I think, in its fourth iteration. It lasts, it's sort of a 2-year cycle. The purpose of the working group is to meet the conceptual as practical challenges to advancing utilization of D&I across the translational science spectrum. So this is when I was one of the leaders. We've really been, it has been very continuous in terms of we've had a rotating group of leaders, but we've a lot of crossover and overlap and continuity, and we're just trying to keep building the science of D&I and the overlap within the CTSA landscape. So it started in 2017. The first group was led by Laura Mae Baldwin. Rowena, she's from the University of Washington. Rowena Dolor from Duke, and Paul Meissner from Einstein Medical School. And really that the D&I themed issue of JHCTS was a big output. I was part of a group with Anna Bauman, Bethany Kwan. Anna Bauman's from Wash U, Bethany Kwan from Colorado. Jane Mahoney is a colleague of mine at Wisconsin. Tara Mehta from University of Illinois, Chicago. And we're still working on some manuscripts and sort of continuing through to the next group, which we've now passed off to Kathleen Stevens from University of Texas Health Sciences Center, San Antonio, Reza Yousefi Nouri from University of Rochester, and Jonathan Tobin from Rockefeller University. So they've now are up to 64 universities engaging in the monthly community of practice teleconference. So it's almost, I guess with the advent of the new funding announcement, I think almost all the CTSAs are recognizing the importance of understanding D&I research. So this group meets monthly via Zoom, third Tuesday at 11 a.m. Central Time. And it's really open to anybody who wants to be involved. So I put a link to the current website where they will list the current activities and priorities of the working group. Their subgroups are forming. There's probably different ways of joining. I know that one way you can just email Reza and can add you to the list. And check out the website here and see what the latest priorities are for the working group. So that's really it. And I finished right at 5 o'clock, so that's good. So I'd like to take as much time as you'd like to answer questions. I'd be interested to hear kind of where you're at with your D&I activities, what your vision is for D&I research going forward. I'm certainly collaborative by nature. I'd love to talk about possibilities for collaboration between MCW and UW-Madison. So with that, I'll leave a link to my lab website. You can read more about the research that I'm engaged in. But maybe I'll bring it back to this slide and just open it up, for the rest of the time for discussion and Q&A. So thank you again for inviting me to talk with your group. I appreciate it, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Andrew. This was a great presentation. You walked us through a lot of stuff. Definitely, you guys in Madison have been on the forefront of this. You are like Lewis and Clark up the Mississippi River going there west of Wisconsin. But clearly, you've had a great experience in building the capacity. And actually, this is maybe a side question I have for you. When you say building capacity, do you think of a system or you think of an individual or D&I?
Of an individual or a system? I mean, I think of it as a system. Well, I think there's an individual level to it as well, but I think of it more as an institutional level. When I joined the D&I faculty and the faculty of the medical school in 2017, I was in the College of Engineering before that, and I had received a career award from NIH to build my own independent research career in implementation science. But I think, one of my goals was to really try to put the University of Wisconsin on the map in terms of implementation science. And I think that it hasn't been just me by any means, but it's been a group effort at the institutional level to kind of build those, to build the ability. I sort of identified myself more in the D&I research community. I know a lot of the authors of the leading papers in that field, where I can't say the same for translational science. It always so it didn't make a ton of sense why D&I wouldn't be really integral to the translational science activities. And I think that recognition is growing. I think UW, we've done a good job by stepping up and taking leadership opportunities, and people, Maureen Smith and Jane Mahoney coming before me and seeing the need for this all the way back in 2011, so really kind of like 10 years ahead of the curve in terms of, we voluntarily created an aim for this, and now it's something that is being required at the federal level. But yeah, I think individuals, through training programs and mentoring and career awards can build their individual capacity to do D&I research. But I think it needs to be supported at the CTSA kind of institutional level. And I think that's what we've been trying to build. And we have, one of my slides was kind of showing that, a lot of the individuals that, started out by reaching out for consultations with the D&I Launchpad are now running big implementation studies. I think of like Yao Liu, who's an ophthalmologist and has the first national trial funded by the National Eye Institute to look at teleophthalmology in rural settings. So really that was an example where she started from a place of not knowing a whole lot, and is now, at least in her field, is probably the most widely recognized practitioner and expert in implementation science. And I could give you other examples of that, but it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. So I think it's one person at a time, but as individuals become more, get more facility with the field, and they're becoming leaders now too. So I do think of capacity, sort of as output of, I think of probably a good measure of capacity is like, how much NIH research funding are we pulling in or around implementation research. That's been something that I've worked hard at, and I think we've definitely built capacity in measurable ways in that respect.
Absolutely. And we are in our preparatory phase of our 4th iteration for the CTSA. So we started to kind of aggregate and then kind of get engaged all the stakeholders and see in what direction we're going. But I think central to this process has been really the NCAT's aligning vision of having the translational science in front and center. And we kept going deliberately very amorphous into this discussion by saying, what is a translational scientist? What is an implementation scientist? Is there overlap? And it's probably very familiar to what you just described in your own investigation there. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that we came up with a concept that is, probably going to be the object of a paper that is in preparation for us, which is that translational scientist encompasses a few disciplines. And it goes from implementation science to, interestingly, systems engineers, and I'm going to have a question for you about that, to interventional science, to quality improvement, to engagement science, to all marketing. I mean, why do our folks in the community don't participate in research? How can you approach? There are so many other disciplines that actually have tackled this issue. As you described, Everett Rogers, in agriculture, even before 1950s, it was like looking at what's the barrier to adoption, how do you improve the curve of adoption, is there any specific channel to communicate, right? So my question to you was, what are the specific skills and specific attributes that systems engineers can bring into this process?
Yeah, well, I think systems engineering is multidisciplinary by design. So when I look back at my training all the way back, I had a lot of coursework in it starts with math, computer science, but then psychology, economics. And I didn't learn behavioral economics, but I think behavioral economics is sort of the merging of psychology and economics. So I think that's where, systems engineers, we have a lot of broad knowledge, maybe not as much deep knowledge in specific, but really to understand systems, I think you have to understand more about how things fit together and work together than being like a specialist. So I think systems engineers are sort of like the generalists of the engineering world. We're not building, I don't know, when I was building hospitals, it was more about understanding how, the whole system works. And, I had my specialty, certain pieces of equipment, but you had to, work with architects, worked with mechanical engineers, general contractors. So I think, sort of the team science aspect of things. This is a lot of what I do now as a principal investigator. Is I sort of know a little bit about a lot of different fields, but I know where I need to outsource and work with real experts. And, like I'll have a statistician, a PhD level statistician will work on the analyses for projects that I lead. But the systems engineering and there's been a real long-standing collaboration between the systems engineering department at UW-Madison and the medical school. And that continues with the health. So I graduated when I was an undergrad. I had my focus was operations research, which is really more mathematically oriented. But when I went back for my PhD, I focused on health systems engineering. So really getting more to specific application in the healthcare field. And that program it was in existence in the 90s when I was as an undergrad, and has just been kind of building in momentum ever since. So I think that's where systems engineering can fit in. I found it has worked very well. The 4 projects I have, the 2 latest ones, I'm multi-PI with MD researchers, and sometimes even more than one MD researcher. But I don't know, I kind of think of myself as like the general contractor of implementation research and being able to put together all the needed components. But then, I know that I need to work with physicians who really understand the clinical aspects of the work that we're doing, and statisticians who can do the analyses, and computer scientists if we're doing technology development, which I do in some of my projects. That's kind of the way that I've thought about it.
Thank you. I have a few other comments and questions, but I'll let other people ask questions.
I had one question. You have a lot of experience of taking these E2I, taking projects through that process. Are there any typical characteristics of projects or initiatives that we should be looking for that are either red flags or the opposite, let's call them green flags, which would determine how an idea is implemented, how the success rate, what really determines what kind of projects you think work better and what don't work so well?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question for sure. And I think we haven't built a large enough sample size to say with any real feel like it's definitive. I mean, I think that probably the thing that if I were to offer my somewhat data informed and data driven answer to this, is that I think it's changing like we need to adopt more of a demand side oriented philosophy. I think what I see a lot in implementation science is a researcher will develop a program or an intervention for a specific, maybe niche kind of thing. And then the investigator has a lot of vested interest in kind of moving forward with their intervention, even if there's not a clear demand in the community, you know, understanding really what the community wants and needs and is willing, you know, in some sense is willing to pay for. Now, it's not all about money, but people need to want what you have to offer. And it might be that they're paying for it with time instead of money. Like, you know, when I work in a family medicine department. And so I've heard a lot of pushback from family physicians about, you know, you're always trying to bring me this thing, but I don't care. You know, it's not what I need. I have real challenges that I want to deal with. So, you know, listening to your stakeholders, I don't want to use the word customer, but I mean, sort of is like that. It's like, what is it that really is, what do people need? And I guess that goes back to that issue of, you know, making science useful to people. Like if what you're doing isn't useful to any real person you can identify, then it's probably not going to, you know, it's not worth pursuing. So just like really taking a step back and saying, this is something that I do in the grants that I review, is just to try to understand like how many people who would care about this, how many people could it impact, how, you know, how effective. It's maybe not even so much about effectiveness as just, you know, would this be useful for enough people to make it worth pursuing? And I think that's often overlooked, and, you know, having ways of assessing that and measuring it and, you know, identifying a gap that could be closed and a feasible way of closing the gap. You know, I think a lot of what we do is often, it's not kind of informed by public health needs or economic considerations or things like, you know, things like that, or cost. I do cost effectiveness analysis in all of my studies because I think it doesn't really make sense to come up with an intervention and then not have any idea what, you know, what it costs to implement, you know, what it's going to cost in terms of staff time, you know, who's going to be willing to pay and things of that nature. So that's my sense. There is some empirical research showing that this sort of customer orientation, understanding involving end users' needs is probably the most important thing to do. So, and then, you know, there's a lot of other things can definitely go wrong or, you know, have to be addressed for implementation to go successfully. But I think it starts first and foremost with like making sure that you're doing something that's important and really there's demand for, and whatever kind of audience you're seeking to reach.
Oh, thank you. Makes sense.
Other questions, comments?
Yes, throwaway comment, the diffusion of innovation as a topic, it reminded me of a quote from a science fiction author that I like, William Gibson, which is, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. So the idea of this concentration of stuff that needs to diffuse to actually define where we're going, but neither here nor there. In terms of the lack of overlap that you described between like translation research and, you know, D&I, just from those like top cited papers that you listed, it to provoke the question, is there a more explicitly biomedical focus in translational research versus a broader dissemination of scientific knowledge within the D&I sphere? Is that true? Is that one reason why they maybe don't overlap as much?
Yes, I think that is true. And that's really the first time I presented those results. So we have that in the paper. I think it is my impression, and part of this is like from going to the ACTS conference, which I don't always go to, but yeah, you have sort of, well, natural silos, I think, of academic disciplines where, you know, you're going to be reading kind of within a biomedical or clinical kind of specialty area, which I think does limit the, you know, whereas implementation research, I think, is broader and more widely applicable. And I think it does get to, you know, being closer to the end stage of the translational process where, you know, some of the differences between the specific disease areas get kind of washed out a little bit. And then you're looking more at sort of like just general principles, where I think you're, you know, often looking at very specific kind of issues when you're, I don't know, one of those articles is, I don't read about mouse genomics or, you know, that kind of thing is outside of my sphere, although I know that there are there's tons of people who do, you know, work in those kind of very specific domains. So yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there. And I like that quote. I think I've heard some iteration of it before. I think it's definitely true as well, because this is one of the things, and I think we're coming to a realization through this work group and its focus on health equity, that we sort of know that, you know, inventions are often, well, as a matter of course, this is one of the principles, you know, they're taken up by people of high socioeconomic status with education and wealth. And so often it's the last, you know, and I think of it too in terms of like the COVID vaccine, where I was driving around the state trying to find the first place I could get vaccinated, as opposed to waiting, you know, for it to come, you know, right to my neighborhood. I know that's not typical, but that is kind of, you know, where there is a demand for these things, for health related interventions. You know, I think that it does start out with the high SES kind of members of the population are going to, in some ways, for better or for worse, are driving a lot of the innovation. But then, you know, it's a huge problem if it's not evenly distributed. And it's you know, it's probably hopeless for it to ever be completely evenly distributed, but there needs to be a lot more kind of emphasis on not just kind of letting the natural course of things go. And, you know, health equity is not going to happen without targeted efforts and focus within the D&I community. I think we all are growing to understand that more and more.
Other questions or comments from the Zoom? People get more courage there. I wanted to get to your second question there also, which is what can we do to collaborate? How can we collaborate? What opportunities exist? And while we are much earlier in that journey, I think this would not be probably the best way going forward to replicate what other people have done over 10, 11 years, i.e. to create their own consultative services and build their own system level capacities at the same level of where you are today. And I think we have to embrace breaking those barriers, those silos, and work collaboratively with other centers that already have the level of expertise. I mean, to my surprise, you already mentioned a collaborator from University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee that I wasn't aware of that was involved in that field of implementation science. So why do we have to recreate the wheel each time, each department, each institution at the time, when we can actually bridge efforts and then bring together capabilities and skills and ways of working together? And what's the end point? In my mind, I think it's more of a kind of a general view, really. Well, all while I'm not in the driver's seat for my institution to implement a strategy, but my view is that all these capabilities will come together in a kind of a transformation office where you have folks who will be practitioners of implementation science and being able to help different teams to take the evidence to the real world practice in day-to-day operations. And the implementation science consultative team that will be more from a scholarly point of view that will help different investigators at various levels of their careers to advance, to apply, to come up with new ideas and how to advance this field. So this is where I'm kind of reaching out to see what opportunities are out there to see how we can work together and be better at what we do together as opposed to alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's growing recognition and I think you're right. I think that we need to have sort of more practitioners. This is something that I've run across as so this capacity issue, I mean, it's no surprise that I'm concerned with capacity. Engineering is, we think about these things all the time. I'd often get requests to consult, provide a D&I consult on a grant, and then it comes the implementation phase, and then there's sort of an implicit but incorrect assumption that I'm the person who's going to then go out and work with the clinics to implement changes, which I have, that's what I have done in my life, but now as a tenured professor, it's not something, the bandwidth runs out very quickly, and so we have to have a more kind of holistic view of what it takes to implement, how you train and train people to be able to kind of replicate the evidence-based approaches of implementation science, but to scale it up. And this is a tough one because, I've read, well, a lot of implementation is about scaling. And I think we've learned a lot from like the business world about scaling. I read a book by John List, who's an economist from the University of Chicago, called The Voltage Effect. He's connected to Wisconsin too. He's someone I've been meaning to reach out to, but one of his conclusions drawn through his book is that human beings don't scale, at least not very effectively. So then I think there's, some issues of like, well, how do we integrate technology and, sort of, I think of like models of organizations, healthcare organizations. Like I'm getting some of my new research is on agent-based modeling and trying to build agent-based models of communities and healthcare organizations. I've hired a PhD student who's been focused on that specifically, but that's really kind of the I think at the cutting edge of the field. But I think this capacity thing is something that keeps coming up. I mean, I've had to step away from even doing some of the D&I consults because I'm currently running 4 NIH R01s, and that takes a lot of my time. So these capacity issues keep coming up, and they're a challenge. I think that there's something to be learned from the diffusion of innovations that quote, the agricultural extension service. I don't know if the leaders of the federal government had that in mind when they created the CTSA program, but there seems to be a real analogy there that, there's an effort to kind of cover the land mass of the United States with technical support. Was more agriculturally focused, which was, more of a challenge of the day, I guess, to make sure that we could that we could feed everybody. And now that we've kind of dealt with that issue, now I think health and well-being are sort of the new priorities. And it does seem like there's some parallels between what the CTSA program is designed to do. You just replace agricultural support with health related, and it's, even in Wisconsin, I think we're seeing that the extension service has morphed to some extent to now be focused on public health kind of issues, and it isn't really about agriculture anymore. So anyway, that's kind of a rambling and long-winded response, but yeah, I think the capacity issue, and there are some individuals, so we should keep talking about this. I'm in conversations with some individuals who I think from other institutions who have recognized the same program and the need to build kind of more of a pipeline of implementation practitioners. And yeah, I think, potentially undergraduate students in health systems engineering, UW-Madison is one place. It's not the only place that's doing it. There's other institutions. I think that might be, that's one of the things that I'm thinking about for the future. And I know that a number of our graduates will go on to, work as like analysts in healthcare systems. I think have tended to be more kind of data driven, but there's always an element of organizational change. That was kind of my first job at Harley-Davidson. The first thing I had to do was query databases and do a data analysis. And I'm like, okay, based on what I'm seeing here, I think the thing we need to change in our operations is this. But then it's a whole new skill set of how do you get people to actually change their practice? So
a lot of change management also starting with innovation, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so interesting. I think we're on the same page in a lot of our, thoughts about the future and needs in the field. So I enjoyed the conversation. I'm happy to continue, and yeah, need to get to Milwaukee one of these days so we can meet up in person. So sorry I couldn't make it today.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this, Andrew, and looking forward for future collaborations.